Aloha everyone, it's Ajanette and I am here to do your chapter 5 and 6 lecture for human sexuality. We're going to do those two chapters together. I am not going to go as in-depth, so please feel free to supplement with a good thorough reading of your chapter and even a good thorough reading of the lecture slides, but I'm going to highlight some things because we have covered gender and sexuality in Safe Zone, and I am going to take this opportunity to kind of discuss some things that maybe weren't already addressed in Safe Zone and build on that foundational knowledge. So as you know, we differentiate between sex and gender in social sciences, where sex is more focused on the physical anatomical traits quite often. It can be chromosomal. And then gender is more of the psychological conception. Sex is something that's often assigned to you based on your physical appearance at birth, whereas gender is a personal identity that one discovers as they get older and is able to kind of share with the world, both verbally and explicitly, as well as they can choose to express their gender in the way that fits them. When we talk about gender, I want us to move away from this notion that gender expansive views and identities are something new, right? Because there's often that narrative, particularly among different political circles, sometimes among different religious circles, and sometimes even age cohorts, right? You find that older generations tend to describe this stuff as new. That's actually not the case. And so what I love about your book and some of the readings, it is going to take us through a historical exploration. And for me, it's going to explore my own culture and how gender expansive identities have been part of my ancient Hawaiian culture long before westernized views spread across the globe. And even within the U.S., our views of gender and sexuality have evolved over time. And so I do want you to open your mind to that and recognize that indigenous communities have long incorporated and recognized gender expansive identities within their cultural practices. The concept of binary sex and gender, man, woman, male, female, it's really an imposition that's come in more modern times, comes with a very westernized, colonialized lens. It definitely is found to be more common in very hierarchical societies where there's power and control associated with social, status. And certainly we see in patriarchal societies, men tend to have higher social status and are perceived in much more empowered ways than women. And so it is really believed that, and we'll talk about social constructions, but we do see that gender is a socially constructed concept, and the binary construction or binary conception of gender serves to maintain those dominant and subordinate ranks among society. So it historically, by putting people in very limited boxes, that very much supports white supremacy, where we do that with race. It supports patriarchy, where we do that with sex and gender. And it really helps to perpetuate colonial domination. And when you see the way in which religion has been used as a tool and mechanism for colonial ideology and efforts, you can see that religion has also been weaponized in a similar way as a means of maintaining power and control for those that have it, and certainly continuing to oppress and marginalize those that don't. And that is particularly true of the LGBTQ community, where a lot of people with gender expansive and sexually expansive identities are very much subjected to religious trauma, and religions often will shame and stigmatize those identities when in reality those identities are as normal as human existence and have been part of human existence since the beginning of humankind. And so hopefully today's lecture draws some attention and sheds some light on that. So let's talk about the way gender has been conceptualized in the U.S. long before our Puritans and Pilgrims arrived. The Native Americans were the original inhabitants of these lands. The Alaskan Native Americans were original inhabitants of the Alaska area, and if I might say, the Native Hawaiians were in fact the original inhabitants of the Hawaiian Islands. And prior to Western influence, or what we call pre-colonial contact, the indigenous views and cultures dominated, American way of life, right? Now, I want to be mindful to note that among Native Americans, there was tremendous diversity, right? So each tribe represented its own cultural community. So I don't in any way want to present them as a monolithic group. I want to definitely explore the ideas that they did each have their own cultural beliefs and traditions and practices. But overall, several indigenous tribes have a documented record that represents gender expansive identities. Now, they may have all called it or referenced it differently, right? But there was a forum in the early 90s, 2000s, that actually allow them to come up with a universal term, and that is Two-Spirit. And Two-Spirit represents those individuals who might embody what is typically thought of as masculine and feminine, or an identity consistent with that of a man or a woman. A Two-Spirit embodies both. And they may even have, some tribes may have a third or fourth category beyond Two-Spirit, where you might see some individuals take on the qualities of both. Some might have originally been born a man but embody the traits typically conceptualized as associated with women, and then vice versa, right? But either way, whether they're grouped together as Two-Spirit or whether they are fit into a separate gender expansive identity for that particular tribe, they still illustrate the diversity of gender that was accepted among indigenous populations long before pre-colonial or before colonial contact. So that being said, in some indigenous tribes, they were even viewed as having special significance, potentially as spiritual guides, healers, and we'll see a similar perspective in the Native Hawaiian community as well. So when we talk about Native American terminology, it's inappropriate if you're not Native American to reference yourself as Two-Spirit. That would be deemed culturally inappropriate. So this is a term reserved for individuals of Native American heritage. Now, historically, you might see old research or documentation that might reference this concept of a bernarchy or bernarch. And that was an assigned word from European contact, and unfortunately also brought with it tremendous stigma, and it was boxed in and conceptualized based upon a Western framework. but more appropriate names that you might see vary across the Navajo, the Lakota, the Zuni, and the other tribes that are listed here. So again, the tribes themselves are diverse, and we want to be mindful that not only might they have a different name that represents the general concept of Two-Spirit within their culture, but they also have each have unique cultural values and traditions and beliefs around Two-Spirit identities. Oops, sorry. Let me go back. Okay, so moving on. Let's look a little bit at the Native Hawaiian community, and this is my cultural background, and so this is definitely something that I think it's important to address and reference, and I take pride in the fact that it is being included. But I remember on the islands, in one of my classes that I was teaching, I actually was among a group of high schoolers, and a conversation broke out amongst the young men in the class, and there was a little bit of homophobia and transphobia being expressed, and I of course called it out, and it then led into this very organic dialogue and conversation, which was met with a lot of resistance and judgment, but it started to convey a theme where sexual diversity was more accepted and supported, but gender diversity was more resisted. And we see that in American culture overall, but in the Hawaiian culture, being expressed by actual Native Hawaiian young men in my class, it was a little surprising to me, if I'm being honest. And I said, how do you explain the mahu? Because their narrative was that it's me kind of pushing my liberal agenda as an educator. And I said, hold on. You're Native Hawaiian, yes? And, he said yes, and as am I. In our very own culture, our ancestors recognize gender diversity, and that's evident by the mahu. And they're like, what is mahu? And so we talked about this group of individuals in Native Hawaiian culture that does represent a third gender, where they also represent qualities of both kane and wahine, and not just one or the other. It is not a binary concept by any stretch of the imagination in the Hawaiian culture. And there were mahu kane, mahu wahine, where where if they were a wahine that lived as a kane, or a kane who lived as a wahine, those were all acknowledged in our ancestral heritage. So it can't possibly be some new concept that liberal academics are just now pushing, when you go back and you see hundreds of years ago this documented in our own ancestral practices and lineage. And so I think it's really important to recognize the opportunity for cultural pride, right? I think, first of all, our ancestors were so brilliant to have recognized gender diversity, and then secondly, they were so inclusive, and that aloha was evident through their inclusive spirit and the way they valued mahu within their community. In ancient Hawaiian culture, mahu were valued identities thought to have spiritual and cultural significance. In fact, they were viewed more as kona that had special powers. And, as we experienced European contact and that colonialization, and our own identities were shamed and that assimilation process occurred through religion, missionary work, and the capitalists and the people coming to exploit our land and resources for their own financial gain. We started to move away from the beliefs and practices and traditions of our own heritage. And so we internalized a lot of that negative stereotyping, and that has continued to impact us today. And so we buy into a lot of these colonial frameworks and mindsets that are not in keeping with the spirit of our ancestors or the beliefs of our ancestors. And even within the Hawaiian culture that was so inclusive and aware at one point in our history, advocacy is still needed even amongst our own people. And who you see here to the right is Kumuhina, and she is one of the powerful activists in Hawaiian culture. She is Mahu, and she is part of the Council for Native Hawaiian Advancement and does great work to advocate for the preservation of our culture and our rights as the rightful heirs to this land and the first occupants of the Hawaiian Islands. So we want to not only preserve our beautiful islands, but we want to preserve the culture that is so integral. Those two things are interdependent. You cannot separate the Aina from the culture or the culture from the Aina. They are ancestral relatives, right? So just sharing, these are just two of the dominant examples in your text, but know that these examples exist among Filipinx cultures, they exist in Indian cultures. So throughout the globe, there are ancient cultures that have long embraced gender expansive identities. When you talk about colonization, and effectively, colonization was not just fulfilling the manifest destiny of the pilgrims that landed here in the United States and expanded them from the East Coast to the West Coast, right? It's really interesting that they were thought to have this natural birthright to take over that land, and yet at the same time that involved cultural genocide. It involved actual genocide of real human beings, and how they determined that somehow they had a superior right to life and to access to the land and resources over that of the original occupants is beyond me. It was based purely on skin color, on race, and those efforts included a tremendous amount of violence, exposure to disease and illness of the native people here, sexual exploitation, objectification, rape of the indigenous people. Particularly sexual violence was used against women, both to elicit compliance from them as well as their fellow tribal members. And they were forced into assimilation. They were dislocated from their lands, stripped of the only resources, and each tribe, was associated with different parts of the land, which all had different climates, different ecosystems, and so they had different skills that they had developed to use the resources that were available in their geographic region. And so when they were, forced on the Trail of Tears and they were relocated, they were displaced from their land, from their resources, from their cultural sites, from their sacred heritage, and forced into areas that they were completely unfamiliar with. So I want you to just imagine if that happened to you. even when we have the opportunity to travel to another city or even another school, when we transfer from a community college or we come from high school to the community college, it seems really foreign to us and we're at a distinct disadvantage. And then when we transfer to the university, we go through that same process. It's very vulnerable, right? So I want you to just think about something that's kind of already built in and seeks to offer us privilege and power and opportunity through that transition. Imagine if you were completely displaced from your lands, your home, and that ancestral knowledge and practice that came with those spaces. It really is, it's horrifying, right? Also think about religious terrorism that was imposed upon them. When we talk about terrorism today, we often stereotype, Middle Eastern individuals who might have, a faith that coincides with the Nation of Islam, and we think of them as terrorists because they're trying to impose their religious beliefs and what we might think of as extremist beliefs on us, right? Or they're angered and disgusted with us because we don't align with their religious beliefs, and so they want to eradicate us. How is that any different than what the colonial pilgrims did across the U.S. and throughout the world, right? In the name of their own belief, in the name of their own religion. Missionaries were a huge part of colonialization. And, we continue to embrace many of those religious beliefs, and somehow that their religion and their spiritual beliefs somehow were deemed to be superior to that of our own indigenous cultures, when one is really more believable than the other, right? But when you're told that you're going to hell, when you're told that, your beliefs are going to bring a wrath upon your people, you're essentially that's fear-mongering, and you're being pressured. And so that took a lot, that there's a lot of trauma that lives on as a result of that. But that was part of colonization. We see this across the globe, not just here in the U.S., but across the globe. So, boarding schools where people were scooped up, children were scooped up, separated from their families, and put into these boarding schools where they were effectively, I'm going to say brainwashed, conditioned. Assimilation is a kind word. They were being stripped of their own cultural identities. They were being stripped of their own language. They were being stripped of their ancestral connections and their kinship and their family connections, their ohana, and consequently they were being forced to adopt this new way of thinking and mindset. And so that Eurocentric and puritanical ideology was forced upon them. And with that came this concept of a gender binary, came this concept of heterosexuality as being, a normative relationship, and sex being critical for reproduction purposes. And we'll talk more about that because that has changed too over the years throughout American history. And so conformity is a very natural trauma response. So when you are effectively invaded and taken over, and you're watching death all around you, you're losing people you love and look to for guidance and cultural connection, and they're being massacred or dying off from disease, conforming is very natural, right? It takes a lot of strategy to resist and to rise up. And when you don't have the weaponry to match what is being used against you. And in some cases, when you have all these different tribes being brought together and forced together, and they come from different languages and different cultural backgrounds, right? Then that can also be a barrier. So that separation and pulling the children away is a strategy to make sure that they can cut off their ability to pass on that cultural knowledge and practice. And sadly, when you're surrounded by these external negative stereotypes, and you're taught that it's a savage way of life, right? You internalize that, and you start to have your own negative beliefs and self-esteem about yourself. And there's tremendous research in social sciences now that really talk about the effects of racial trauma and the trauma that continues to impact us generations later because of this colonialization and the terrorism that was inflicted upon indigenous cultures. So when we talk about policing, and I know post-George Floyd, there was a movement about defunding police, and it created a lot of political divide, and people became very angry. But I think it's important to understand the history of policing in the United States. Remember that we went to, not only did we terrorize the people that already lived on these lands as we were taking over these lands, but we also went to the African continent, and we literally kidnapped and stole people and trafficked them to the U.S. to work for us. We enslaved them and inflicted horrific abuses upon our African fellow human beings. And we built this country on the backs of enslaved individuals. And they were completely displaced to another continent, right? And I'm not trying to get into like the trauma Olympics and suggest that one experience or history is worse than another. I'm merely bringing that up to help you understand that the origins of the policing system that exists today came from the establishment of slave patrols. So as members of these marginalized communities, quote unquote, escaped, literally the slave patrols were given the authority to hunt them down, kill them if needed, but use whatever violence at their disposal to force them into submission and bring them back to their owner. This is a human being, right, that was stolen already from their own homeland, that had their own life and their own culture and their own beliefs and their own social status. And we snatched them up and brought them here. And we police them. And so race was often that determining factor for who was the giver of the violence and who was the receiver. And throughout history, particularly American U.S. history, it was the white man inflicting the violence on people of color. It was the people of color who were subjugated. And so that race was used as a weapon to establish a caste system, to establish a hierarchy that also established economic destinies, right? And it has been maintained and enforced through our law enforcement systems. To this day, we have used legislation and then the executive branch to enforce that legislation to do harm to communities of color throughout history. African Americans, Native Americans, Kanaka or Hawaiians, Native Hawaiians, the Chinese, the Asian immigrants that came when we were building the railroads. They were actually the ones where we enacted the first law to literally control and restrict immigration. And so, and it goes on and on and on. In many ways, the legislation that came after 9/11 was our way of policing and controlling Middle Eastern immigration and our Middle Eastern residents. And so we have to be mindful when we're looking at the current protest or the current social conditions, understanding the historical components that have contributed to our social systems and their existing development, and some of those continued ideologies that are still very present in the way those systems function, and the hierarchy that exists is so important. So be careful about judging. Recognize that there could be many experiences, traumas, and perspectives that you don't know about, that just because you don't experience those things doesn't mean they don't exist, right? And when you're not experiencing or you're not understanding, that might be an opportunity to check your own privilege. Recognize that that might be an area of your identity where you're on the top of the social hierarchy, and you have an opportunity to learn and expand your compassion and aloha and inclusion for those that may be lower on that hierarchy, and try to understand maybe the ways in which individuals with those other identities may have been oppressed and marginalized throughout history and continue to be today. Certainly, gender has a hierarchy, and sexuality has a hierarchy, and race is probably the most explicit example of these social hierarchies and power and privilege, hierarchies that exist in society, American society today. So moving on, I do, when we talk about these identities, and you did the social identity activity in the onset of the class starting, that was intended to really get you to sit and meditate on your identities. And if it's something that you did more casually, I'm going to encourage you to go back now, right? And go back and review those identities again and think about your various identities. For me, I present as white, and so I've experienced white privilege, but I also am Native Hawaiian. I come from a family of color, and I have experienced oppression and marginalization as a result of that familial connection, right? I grew up poor. As a woman, I experience I'm in a different place on that hierarchy, but all those identities intersect, right? So not all women experience the same power and privilege, right? Or oppression and marginalization. White women, because they're white and that whiteness intersects with their gender, that gives them a different level of privilege than, let's say, a Black woman or a Latinx woman or an Asian woman, right? So we have hierarchies for race, we have hierarchies for gender. Those things intersect and create different unique experiences for all women, but of different racial and ethnic backgrounds, right? And so you might be exposed to different microaggressions based on that intersectional identity. And you may identify with more strongly to certain aspects of your identity than others. For instance, my daughter very much embraces her Hawaiian identity. She's part of a halau. She hulas. She's learning the language. My son doesn't embrace it at all. He, is like, I'm a mutt. My daughter speaks a little Japanese because on her father's side she's Japanese. And so she knows a lot about her Japanese heritage as well. My son doesn't embrace any of it. So you can embrace some elements of your identity more than others. I do want to be mindful when we talk about BIPOC communities, that's Black, biracial, Indigenous, or a person of color, right? So I am a BIPOC individual, even though you might look at me and see me as a white woman, right? Because I am biracial. I have that Hawaiian, and I also have that white racial appearance. And so I don't really fit with a group of people who have like European ethnic identities that come from, that are, white, and I don't totally look like, the people that are fully Hawaiian either, right? So sometimes it's like that Selena movie. You're not Mexican enough for the Mexicans, and you're not American enough for the Americans. Sometimes sitting in that mixed position brings with it additional stress and trauma as a result. But when you are talking about BIPOC communities, when we're talking about these gender expansive identities, a transgender person of color experiences additional criticism, scrutiny, stereotyping, microaggressions, and even violence than a transgender individual who's white. And that's sad, but undeniable based on the data. A transgender woman of color is actually the category that is most likely to be assaulted and murdered in our country, proportionately speaking. Now, when you look at all the people who've been murdered and you say, oh, it's mostly men, right? Yeah, but when you look at relative to their representative proportion in the overall population, the risks are significantly higher for transgender individuals, and specifically for transgender individuals of color. So just the fact that they continue to exist, continue to own their identities, continue to embrace their authentic selves, gosh, what strength and resilience, right? In the face of all of this hatred throughout history here in the United States, and yet they still continue to be a thriving community. That says a lot about their strength, resilience, character, and a lot to be admired. Okay, so when you talk about all of this history, right, like how do we heal from it? I'm in a place where I'm exploring, I'm studying Hawaiian studies, I've done my associates, I'm doing my bachelor's at this moment. Maybe you'll be watching this video when I'm already done with my bachelor's at some point. But as I'm learning the ways in which my people have been terrorized, oh my gosh, it hurts. It pisses me off. I'm angry. I'm bitter. I'm resentful. I'm all of those things. And I'm sitting with those emotions. I'm making space for those emotions. And sometime in the future, I will move past those emotions toward healing. I'm not there yet, but I'm thankful that others that have come before me in this journey are there. And part of the healing has been the reclamation of those identities. It's been the reclamation of their oral histories. The westernized world came over and they were now a written culture. Most of the indigenous cultures that pre-existed them here in the United States, what is now known as the United States, as well as in Hawaii, we were oral cultures, right? So our history and record keeping was passed down through our chanting, through our mele, through our ole, through those oral histories, through talk story and those legends that would be shared and told from one generation to the next, right? The legends of, our gods, our ali'i, the legends of our own ancestors, the intersections thereof of how maybe our ancestors became our amakua, the genealogy and our birthright and our lineage and where we came from, even the history, the oral histories of different regions and lands and the ohana that occupied those lands and and poured their heart into the caretaking of the Aina, right? All of that was preserved through oral history. And Kamehameha in particular was very observant of the written records that were being kept when Cook arrived. And he took note in how valuable and instrumental those could be to our people moving forward. And so once we became, he unified us into a Royal Hawaiian Kingdom, we were actually one of the most literate countries in the world, because that value in the written culture was recognized early on. However, the sad thing is the oral histories were devalued and sometimes lost. And so there is a reclamation that needs to be had. Those stories, I was talking to one of my students recently, and she was sharing how a lot of that ancestral knowledge that was passed on orally and was devalued is now being explored and studied by scholars who are finding out that those oral histories actually contained important fact and information about the environment that helps to answer questions about evolution and biology and zoology. So we have to be cautious about discrediting the oral histories as well. Additionally, what we've seen is social movements, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, Indigenous peoples movements. We saw with the fight over Mauna Kea and the telescopes, we actually saw a cultural revitalization happening. And so it is beautiful to see these movements, right? But we also kind of need to know the history and the oppression that is fueling these movements as well. And activists and scholars are exploring the effects of the trauma of colonization and exploring ways in which we can restore our people to their rightful lands wherever possible, to their water rights wherever possible, and certainly to their identities. And then we do have this investigative report produced by the Department of Interior in 2022. I'm going to encourage you to review that, familiarize yourself, see if maybe there's areas where you might want to get involved in your respective community, particularly if you have Indigenous heritage. We are also reclaiming our voices, right? You see a movement that is drawing attention to the two-spirit identities, to the Mahu identities, and helping educate society as a whole about the negative impacts of colonization and oppression on these queer Indigenous identities. And so we want to make sure that we're doing our best to be an ally, to be educated in these areas, to participate where we can. And then there's a concept called emotional emancipation circles, where it is a cultural practice where we can bring people together and think of it as an Indigenous support group, right? Where you have these opportunities to share your own experiences with, the various types of marginalization that you've been exposed to based upon, the colorism that might exist in your community, racism, sexism, heterosexism, right? What types of prejudice, bias have you experienced? How have you been marginalized, oppressed, abused, exploited? And that allows us to come together and share those common experiences. Sometimes just the sharing can be a source of healing. The camaraderie that exists, the validation that one often receives in this type of environment, because it's not just you experiencing these things. That can really be valuable. They might also be able to give advice and share tips and strategies and resources that have been useful to them that may also be useful to you. So it becomes a source of exchange, a community of love and empowerment and support, and a very valuable tool for healing. There's other resources that your textbook provides to get a more multicultural perspective of gender. So I'm going to encourage you to look over the map, right? Look at how colonization has extended internationally, not just here in the United States. Look at resources that are available for Indigenous communities throughout that are listed here. And if you know of some for Native Hawaiian communities, let me know and I can incorporate them, or Alaskan Indigenous communities, let me know and I can incorporate them. So let's get into a little bit of the psychology of gender. So again, we've differentiated between sex, which is assigned at birth, and gender, which is socially constructed. We definitely know that gender itself is a complex interplay or interaction among different factors and different components, right? Our body, our psychological identity, and our social relationships. All of those things interact to shape our gender identities. Our body, how do we experience our bodies? Often I have my transgender students describing a feeling of betrayal, feeling like their body betrayed them, feeling like they feel like they are in the wrong body, right? And a lot of that goes against what their social and cultural context has told them. And, you know, a lot of how we experience our bodies, how we dress our bodies, how we carry our bodies, the activities we engage in with our bodies, a lot of that is kind of governed and influenced and dictated by societal expectations and demands. Identity is our psychological perception of ourselves, right? That might be proclaiming, I am this gender, that gender, or another gender, right? It might also mean you're rejecting all categories that exist altogether. It can mean that I am going to fall within the binary, I'm going to fall out of the binary, or I'm going to blow it up altogether and identify as agender. But most definitely, as I'm coming to explore my own identity, it's not something you're born with. It's not something that's given to you. It's something that you discover that evolves organically and naturally over time. As you grow, as you mature, as you expand your knowledge and understanding, as you gain vocabulary, right, that might be able to name what you're feeling, you might, within your own familial context, not feel like what you're experiencing is normal. But then when you have the opportunity through education and experience to be exposed to other people who might also share those feelings and experiences, it provides some validation and some perspective that might support that evolution of your gender identity. And then obviously that social context is so important, because as human beings, we are social creatures, right? And we are punished in our environment, we are reinforced in our environment. But how we present gender to the world elicits reactions. And in modern society, often when you are not subscribing to that very fixed binary perspective, it subjects you to tremendous scrutiny, right? And abuse. And so, you know, that implicitly erodes your own confidence in your identity. And so we're socialized, we're trained, we're conditioned to be a certain way based upon the gender that's being imposed on us, which is often assumed to be just based on that sex. And most people don't even realize that your sex is diverse and non-binary, right? Most people don't realize that there are more than two sexes. And so, because they're so limited in assuming that gender and sex are one and the same, they don't always have the capacity to understand the diversity of gender identities. But That's why education matters, right? So when we talk about gender congruence, we're talking about that harmony that exists within a person when they feel at peace with their gender identity, right? When they feel like they can name their gender, they can express their gender in a comfortable way outwardly to the world, and when the world sees them and embraces them for themselves. We might find that you're not automatically born with gender congruence. You as your gender identity evolves, you can step into that space. We might consider somebody who's moving from a binary construction into an expansive identity as transitioning. I would welcome you to consider it more as an alignment, right? As a liberation rather than a transition. A transition further limits them, and we really want to liberate them. We really want people to have the freedom and the voice and the autonomy to choose for themselves, right? So you might have people who socially to the outside world are presenting themselves differently in their clothing, their mannerisms, their hairstyle. You might have people actually taking hormones that can be physically changing their bodies, or maybe suspending or, additional pubertal changes, hormonal changes. You might have people leveraging surgical options to help their bodies reflect their identity. And you might see people taking legal steps, maybe to change their birth certificate, their ID, so on and so forth. That being said, a person can be, transitioning or aligning in all of these areas or none of these areas. That none of those actual steps there, none of those things cement and affirm their identity or undermine their identity. Their identity is valid all on its own. So definitely gender and orientation intersect. Sexual orientation is still a separate and distinct identity, but it's a related identity. We want to be cautious about making assumptions based on someone's gender or gender expression. For example, it's commonly thought that a very effeminate male is perceived as gay. Not the case, right? Sometimes the most masculine of men who have a very cisgender identity are gay. And sometimes the most feminine of men who are also cisgender can very much be heterosexual. You might also have individuals that might take on some, let's say someone that's been assigned male at birth, and they take on some feminine expression, right? But that does not automatically mean they're transgender either. So don't make assumptions about gender identity or sexuality purely based on how someone looks and expresses. Here's some terminology, as much of this was already covered in the Safe Zone module, but I would like you to make sure you review this, capture it in your notes. Again, pay special attention to words with which you don't automatically know, you're not familiar. Always take more detailed notes on new concepts, on new information. That note-taking process itself will help to solidify your understanding of that concept. And then let's go dive into some of the theories as we're looking at the psychology of gender. Freud, of course, the psychoanalytic perspective is the foremost theory in our field, and Freud had a number of theories. His developmental theory in particular, his psychosexual theory of development, suggested that all females have penis envy. Somehow the penis was deemed superior, kind of went along with the very patriarchal, sexist views in the Victorian era in which he grew up. And his theory suggested we go through different stages, the oral, anal. I should incorporate a slide that shows you the different stages. So it's not in here now, but I will incorporate that. But that being said, he suggested that if we do not know how to manage our penis envy in a healthy way, that we can become fixated. And effectively, all girls are fixated in the phallic stage. We're forever trying to, make up for the fact that we don't have a penis. And that might be through, being sexually promiscuous. That might be through, being submissive and compliant and trying to win the affections of the superior penis. It's a very sexist theory, if you haven't already guessed. What I love about Karen Horney, she also was a psychoanalytic theorist. One of the first women in our field, one of our pioneers, and early feminist, right? She not only criticized Freud's the sexism in his theory, but she had the boldness and audacity to say, no, not only do we not have penis envy, but you have womb envy. Like, we are the bearers of life. And so you are jealous and envious of us and our capacity to bring children into this world. And as such, you're constantly trying to compensate for your insecurities and lack of a womb and lack of childbearing ability through, trying to go out there and be successful and achieve and dominate, kind of imagine it like dogs, like, peeing on their territory, right? That's what she suggested. She suggested it was all attempts to compensate for their lack of a womb. That was a pretty brave and bold premise, especially in her time. And so she was pretty badass. She also went on, just like Freud's theory and the psychoanalytic perspective, Freud felt like our early childhood experiences were instrumental in our development. And those childhood experiences were formative of our personality and our pathologies, right? And she did have a similar view in that she suggested when we are exposed to or raised in abusive, neglectful, harmful environments, that is the root of basic evil, right? That we can develop a hostility toward our parents who were abusive. Not only did they not meet our needs, but they may have actually been abusive to us. And so that frustration and animosity turns into hostility because they didn't give us the loving, nurturing support that we needed. And that could actually fuel the development of what she called a masculinity complex, which is, a feeling of inferiority that women develop, right? And, as we're trying to make it in this male-dominated world, we actually have this deep-rooted insecurity that will never be good enough. And so that can either fuel a sense of competition and drive us to lean into it, or for some of us, it might drive us away. It might cause us to withdraw, and we don't want to compete at all, right? And I think I know people who've experienced that, that may explain what she was observing to inform her theory. So here's some interpersonal strategies that Horney proposed in terms of, how we might respond to that hostility that we carry and that inferiority complex that might develop. She suggested that we can have this compliant where we just fall in line, right? We lean into it. We can detach, kind of pull ourselves away, break away, Or we can actually kind of rail against it and have some expansive solution like she did. No, I absolutely disagree with your concept of penis envy, and I actually counter that with a concept of womb envy. So, not penis identity, penis envy. Okay. Gender socialization theory moves away from the psychoanalytic perspective, and it suggests that it's not just those childhood experiences, it's not just those unconscious processes that are happening, but we're actually socialized in a much more observable, practical way based on our environment and familial influences. So yes, this particular perspective still values early life experiences like the psychoanalytic, but it's not based on what it's doing to our psyche or unconscious, but instead understanding what types of gender experiences we've had in our world. And, that exposure then can influence our own gender identity and conception of gender. Research has actually been done on infants and children in those early years, and we've seen that 18 years and younger, infants can in fact differentiate between a male voice and a female voice. We do see, obviously, we expose them to different gendered toys. I'm going to baby shower this weekend. She had a little girl, so you buy dolls and different things. Even when you try to buy clothes, right? They're very gendered because we live in a very gendered world. Well, children actually will start to develop a preference for the gendered toys that they are given and exposed to. We actually, interestingly enough, by age 2, they can correctly identify who's a boy and who's a girl. So they are picking up on those gender stereotypes. They quickly and intuitively can see what aligns with those gendered expectations for a boy and a girl as early as age 2. And then also they definitely get a more advanced and mature understanding of stereotypes as they continue to age. And they go into a period where they're very rigid in their thinking, and that happens in that early childhood, and then they become more fluid and flexible in their conceptions of gender as they advance into middle childhood. Girls being more flexible than boys. Interestingly enough, mothers are shown to have more flexible and supportive perceptions of gender expansive identities as well. So we need to examine that more carefully. When you talk about gender socialization theory, as I mentioned, it too focuses on the parental influences. Think about those parental influences really from conception, not just after a child is born, because we start to gender our children in pregnancy. How we talk to them, the things that we start to buy for them, the clothes that we start to buy, the way that we decorate the nursery, the words that we use to describe them very much is gendered and falls within the typical societal conceptions. Additionally, interestingly enough, if you look at an infant, you can't tell whether they're boys or girls, right? It's the clothing, it's the things around us that tell us whether it's a boy or girl. If you dress the same exact baby in boy clothes, it's treated differently by people, strangers, than if you dress them in girl clothes. Same exact baby. And so that's been really interesting to read some of that research and see how we start to impose that upon children, reinforcing or punishing behavior that may or may not align with those gendered expectations. Sadly, parents implicitly, sometimes explicitly, but implicitly condition their children into kind of some gender stereotypes. Independence is valued and prized in our boys, not so much in our girls. We really overestimate our sons' abilities and think they're more capable and stronger and faster and more powerful. and underestimate our girls' abilities. And that's problematic. We also kind of stereotype and have expectations that our boys should be able to do things, even think about if you have a brother or sister of the opposite sex, what were the rules in the house? How were they treated differently than you? Were they allowed to do things you weren't allowed to do? Did you feel like their gender made a difference in how they were treated by mom, dad, aunts, uncles, society, by what privileges they were allowed and what they weren't, how much control was exercised over them or not? So think about that. Think about how that affects our own psychological adjustment, our own identity development, right? But when we have different beliefs and expectations for our children, they can rise to those expectations or fall to those expectations. And when we tend to set higher expectations of achievement and success for our boys than we do our girls, it creates very problemed. Sometimes the girls might internalize that and feel like they're not loved as much or they're not valued as much. Sometimes it affects their self-esteem where they don't believe in their own abilities as much, right? Sometimes it absolutely has a direct impact on their achievement. So I say set high expectations for all of them and let them all strive. And then, of course, to close this, the recommendation is to involve as much gender-neutral parenting as possible. Offer just as much love, support, opportunity, expectation, reinforcement, encouragement to your girls and your boys. Encourage your boys to be emotional, to be nurturing, to be loving, to express their emotions. Encourage your girls to be strong, to be independent, to be fighters, to be vocal, right? All those things that don't fall into the traditional gender expectations for that presumed gender of a child, promote anyway. Effectively, just promote healthy, fully emotionally functional and intelligent children, right? Who grow up to be functionally, emotionally intelligent adults. And then also, gender socialization theory looks at the influence of peers and socializing. Obviously, as children get older and they're spending more time with peers, particularly in elementary school, peer influence starts to become more important, becomes extremely important in adolescence. And the peers are often the ones that, again, implicitly and explicitly guide that gendered behavior, reinforce and punish behavior. And again, typically when they're younger, that non-conforming gendered behavior is very much faced with scrutiny and ridicule. And what that does is it punishes them for behaving in a nonconformist way, punishes them for a gender expansive identity, and it forces them into compliance with the binary. And the way in which children play also reinforces gender identity and rules. They tend to be very gender segregated in their play, or sex segregated when they're younger. You see all the boys huddled together and a couple girls, because girls tend to play in like pairs and partners, and boys tend to play in groups. Boys tend to be very activity based and girls tend to be very relational based. And some of that comes from the way they've been socialized, right? The models that they have around them. So there's a number of reasons. It doesn't necessarily mean it's inherent biological differences. A lot of it is socially and culturally influenced. Oh, skipped a slide. Media matters, right? Media is a universal modeling system for us. I'm wondering if, yeah, it's coming. Modeling's coming. And so media is often very stereotypical, and we've only recently seen some of those trends breaking. We see recently, like Shonda Rhimes is one of my favorite, Grey's Anatomy is one of my favorite, and these badass, powerful women in what were historically thought of as male-dominated careers and jobs, and they're kicking ass. And so that's important to see that media representation. I also love that we see women of color in those badass positions. So not only is she elevating that representation for women, but for women of color. We see this happening In print media, where historically the media that's targeting girls is very much focused on appearance, body image, relationships, and it has a negative effect on our self-esteem as young girls. Whereas the media, the print media geared toward boys, it's very occupation, sports focused, right? Hobby focused. So it teaches them to be much more developed beyond their appearance than the girls. And then the video games, also you see female characters very sexualized, and male characters are often aggressive, right? So we have to be careful about how those things are influencing our children. Have realistic conversations. Porn even is very sexualized. It's very objectifying of women. I've talked to my son about that, to look at how women are represented in porn as well. So those are things to consider as well. Then there's school influences. So parents, peers, media, school. Your teachers are a huge socializing agent, okay? And sadly, there's all kinds of research to show that teachers are biased in how they interact in classrooms. And there is a very clear gender bias where teachers focus just more of their time and attention in general toward boys, but also the positive attention is also geared toward empowering boys far more so than girls. Typically, attention is drawn to girls for domestic traits or qualities, like being organized and cleanly. That's where they get the compliments. Versus a boy, oh, you're so smart, you're so hardworking, right? Be careful, even compliments are sending implicit messages. So send those badass, empowering messages to the girls. Send those sensitive, kind, nurturing messages to the boys, right? Because you are raising your sons to be fathers and husbands. And what kind of father and husband do you want them to be? Whether it is in a same-sex relationship or whether it's in a heterosexual or any other variation thereof. Research clearly shows that fathers that can express love, nurturing, sensitivity, compassion are actually more well-received and have healthy relationships with their daughters and sons and their transgender children. So we want to do our best to promote emotional wholeness in all of our children, regardless of gender identity. And notice that we're talking a lot about studies have looked at how teachers treat boys and girls differently, how parents treat boys and girls differently. There's very little research on how they treat transgender children, and what kind of treatment other than negative do they get. What type of compliments do they receive by their teachers? So definitely an area of future research, an area of need, right? So consider that for your bachelor's projects, doctoral, and master's theses as well. Modeling comes out of Albert Bandura's theory. He did the famous Bobo doll experiment, if you've taken a psychology class before. But modeling is basically we watch other people and they serve as models for us, right? They're teaching us how to behave, what's right, what's wrong. We're watching how they get punished and how they get reinforced. But they're teaching us the rules of life, the rules of gendered behavior. What are we supposed to be doing? What's expected of us? What happens when we engage in those behaviors? What happens when we step out and violate those expectations? They also model rigidity and flexibility. Are they showing openness? Are they showing receptiveness to gender expansive identities? Are they making critical jokes and comments? Are they rejecting and cutting people off with gender expansive identities? So all of those things send messages to us. The social cognitive theory suggests that yes, we're socialized. Yes, we learn from our environments. Yes, modeling is important, but we also filter it through our own cognitive perceptions, right? So we combine that social learning and cognitive models that look at how are we interpreting, how are we perceiving those experiences. Sometimes we receive direct instruction on what we should think, feel, and how we should behave. Sometimes it's through modeling. Sometimes there's inactive experiences where I actually seek out, like maybe I like sports, and so I go play with the boys on the soccer field, and I kick their ass out there, right? So I'm initiating, I'm creating those experiences on my own, versus like a coach telling me, oh no, football's for boys, you can't do this, right? And social cognitive theory, even though it's combining social and cognitive perspectives, it still recognizes our own biological forces that influence individual development and perceptions. But the gist of this is perception matters. If I perceive something as being valuable or beneficial, I'm going to put more time and energy into it than if I don't perceive it. And the beauty about this particular theory is it doesn't just focus on what happened in our childhood and how that made us who we are. We continue to evolve throughout life. We continue to filter things, even as you're in a class, learning about how your childhood may have impacted your development, thinking about how your parents may have shaped your gender identity or expression, right? As we are learning this new information, we're refiltering those experiences through a new lens, through a new set of knowledge. And so that might change our perception. That might change our perception of our parents, of our childhood, and of ourselves. And so we need to be welcoming to the idea that this is iterative. Our gender identity is explored throughout our lives, and consequently, it can evolve over the course of our lifespan. Some of the more prominent cognitive theories include Kohlberg's theory and gender schema theory. Lawrence Kohlberg is most famous for his moral development theory, which is largely based after Piaget's theory. But that being said, he very much is grounded in a cognitive perspective, and he feels like children actively seek out experiences, right? They actively seek out people and knowledges that appeal to their individual characteristics, traits, and identities. And so they have their own perceptions of the world or the way they interpret things. And consequently, that active engagement serves, and the perception, serves to influence their gender identity. And he suggested gender identity starts to take shape at about age 3. Children are declaring themselves as a boy or a girl. They may even declare themselves as transgender, maybe not with the language, but they were assigned male at birth and they're declaring themselves a girl. We may not put that label on them. We may just allow them to express their gender however they see. And then that can evolve and take shape in a very organic way as they grow and as they learn. But at about age 5, they do kind of get this conception of gender constancy, suggesting they recognize that, I can't change myself from male to female. I would argue that this is a little outdated. The language should maybe be more sex constancy, or they should understand that it's not constant, but maybe gender consistency, right? There is gender fluidity, no doubt, and there is an evolution of gender identity over our lifetime. But even an individual that might have a gender fluid identity, the fluidity is a consistent trait of that gender identity, if that makes sense. So maybe coming back and revisiting these concepts, given our new understanding and our new research. Gender schema theory. When you talk about schema, think about like file folders in our brain. How are we organizing, conceiving, conceptualizing different things? Your book talked about them as templates or outlines. They serve as a cheat sheet for us where it comes to gender. They tell us, this is what boys are supposed to do. This is what girls are supposed to do. This becomes like our own guide, and often, unfortunately, it's informed by stereotypes. It's informed by that binary conception as well. it also creates this hierarchy and reinforces and perpetuates that hierarchy. And, it influences how we think of ourselves, both our own sex and our own gender. And it also influences how we think of others. But it kind of, our conceptions of gender identity form through phases. First, we recognize our gender group. Oh, I'm a girl, I'm a boy. I build schemes about like what's the template and expectations that I'm seeing in the world for boys and girls. I'm, keeping track of those in my own mental log. Then I have this very rigid phase, like I have to adhere to, what's on the log for the boys and what's on the log for the girls. And that typically passes and moves from that very binary either or to a more open, expansive, flexible. And I know a lot of people say, well, I don't want to have these conversations. Honestly, they don't need to be complex conversations or in-depth conversations. And honestly, your children in elementary school are probably more likely to guide the conversation than you are, or more capable than you are. They just don't make it as complicated as we do. They really don't. They're far more accepting of diversity than we recognize. So they're a wonderful model for us. Biological theories, evolutionary theories, genetic theories, epigenetic theories, and learning theories. When we talk about evolutionary theories are centered around the concept of natural selection, adaptation, right? Survival of the fittest. And so often they're focused on sex-based explanations because sex is biological. And when we talk about evolution, like, that gene, that chromosomal evolution and adaptation happens, we typically will look at, how does this behavior help to support survival, right? And when we talk about, gender expansive and sexually expansive identities, well, they're not always viewed as being helpful to reproduction. And so therefore, they're not really considered to be adaptive, right? Or evolutionary. They don't support our continued survival and existence as a species. Gender roles, however, historically support survival, right? But in modern times, they may not anymore, right? We don't need to be a hunter-gatherer society anymore. So now that we've evolved, there's new needs now, new behaviors. So those primitive ways now may be barriers. Kinship-based explanations looking at those family units, those kins, and how that community can promote survival. And also within the family, the strongest DNA survives, right? And kinship-based explanations, they don't really look at dividing tasks along gender or sex lines. They really look at who has the greatest strength and ability within that family unit, and that person would be assigned to the said task. And then sociocognitive explanations, really looking at that social environment and how we are conceptualizing that and internalizing that. And again, as we evolve, right, now our social needs change, how we perceive things cognitively is going to change in response to those new things, whether it's tools, whether it's gender roles, whatever it might be, right? We may have hunted with more primitive tools, and now we have less primitive tools. And so now that we have evolved and we've created these tools to help aid in our survival, now we have to reconceptualize that need for male dominance, right? And the strength that was needed for their hunting role isn't critical and necessary anymore. So again, we have to reconceptualize this concept of masculinity and its relative value to us as a society. And then finally, biological theories. Obviously genes are biological, and we do we have identified certain genes as being directly related to our physical traits, but our psychological traits too, like our emotionality, like our personality. Behavioral genetics suggests, so behavioral genetics uses twin studies and adoption studies to look at the relative contribution of genes versus the environment on shaping psychological behaviors and outcomes. This will come up again in sexuality. But that being said, we compare, adopted children to non-adopted children. So we can take an adopted child and compare them to their biological parents or to their adoptive family. We can also do twin studies where we compare twins to their non-twin siblings compared to each other. It matters if they're fraternal twins or monozygotic twins, where monozygotic twins share 100% the same DNA. They came from the same egg, and dizygotic or fraternal twins did not. So they have different genetics, just like any other sibling. Monozygotic has the same. And when you see traits more consistent among monozygotic twins, you assume that there's a greater genetic influence there. Gender non-conforming or gender expansive identities are more common among monozygotic twins than they are among dizygotic twins. So with identical twins, if one twin has a gender expansive identity, there's a higher rate and likelihood that that other twin will as well than you see among fraternal twins. That tells us a lot, right? We also see when you have an individual that's intersex and has, anatomy and genitalia of both sexes, or they may have internal organs of one sex and genitalia of the other. Often when they have surgical intervention, regardless of whether they're chromosomally male or not, they're often, it's easier to excise tissues, so surgical interventions often sought out, and they will be surgically, what am I trying to say? They will be, their genitalia will be made more consistent with that of a female, and they will be raised as a girl. And in those circumstances, we find that not only is there a higher risk of psychological health challenges, they have a higher risk of suicide, but often we find that the child, even though they've been raised as a girl, they naturally will seek out an identity and expression that aligns more with who they are. And so we see this with intersex, we see this with individuals who may have had damaged genitalia for, an accident as a young child or something. And when they have that surgery imposed upon them at a young age, it may or may not be a decision that aligns with the identity that evolves and develops later on in their life. So it can be very traumatic. Epigenetics looks at the environmental influence on genes, right? So when we're raised in high stress environments, our genes can literally be modified. We pass that down from generation to generation. We see this with generational and racial trauma, right? It's passed down from generation to generation. And then we see now that our communities of color, our Native Americans, our African Americans, they actually have a lower life expectancy. So we need to be mindful of how those environmental experiences, including trauma, impact us genetically. That being said, there was a drug that was readily prescribed to pregnant women in the 40s to 70s, and it actually mimics estrogen, but it caused all kinds of mutations. And not only did it increase the rates of cancer, it also impacted limbs. There was all kinds of things. But there's been a more recent study that shows that exposure, when you look at that population, About 10% of the people who have participated in studies of individuals exposed to the DES drug, about 10% of them identify as a gender expansive identity. And that's, we see about 1% of the general population. So clearly that estrogen exposure had some impact, right? And then just some general resources. So when we talk about learning about the LGBTQ community, as an ally, it's important that you should be informed, you should be aware, continuously seek out information so that you aren't inadvertently and unintentionally committing microaggressions against individuals with gender expansive identities, and that your language and your writing and your educational pursuits and your professional conduct isn't in any way biased, right? You want to do your best to be inclusive wherever you can. So I'm going to encourage you to review some of these resources and what stands out as being most helpful to you, right? What stands out as being something that you can do to be an ally and to continue to advocate for the rights, protections, and thriving of our gender expansive community. And with that, I'm going to pause. I'm going to do a part 2 and dive into sexual orientation in part 2. I will bid you much love and aloha. Take a break, step outside, walk around a little bit, get a snack, but definitely stop here, and then we'll give you a new link for part 2. Mahalo.